surface portion. Well, plant materials that make up the organic matter that's going into this soil, we need to take a minute to discuss that so that we have a basic understanding of what these organic components of plants are. The first group I want to talk about are the carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrates, what that term basically means is organic compounds which are composed of the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The general proportion of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen is about a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. That holds true for simple carbohydrates, but as we get into more complex carbohydrates, that's not necessarily going to be the exact ratio. But in a general sense, let's use the 1 to 2 to 1 ratio for carbon to hydrogen to oxygen. Well, carbohydrates are not compounds which are very resistant to decay. So as they are a part of the organic residue, we would think of these compounds as being easily broken down by the microorganisms that are involved in this organic matter decay. Carbohydrates can be put into some broad groups, such as the sugars, the starches, the hemicellulose, and the cellulose types of compounds. Typically, plants which are young, juvenile, and actively growing will have a lower amount of the more complex carbohydrates, like the cellulose, in proportion to the quantity of sugars and starches or less complex carbohydrates. So from a standpoint of complexity, the sugars are more simple than the starches, and which are more simple in structure than the hemicellulose and the cellulose correspondingly. But irregardless of what type of carbohydrate we're talking about, these microorganisms have the ability to metabolize these quite rapidly. A certain amount of the carbon in these carbohydrates is going to be released as CO2 gas into the soil atmosphere, and a certain amount of it's going to be metabolized and used to make more microorganisms as these populations gear up to break this residue down. Another thing that's worthy of note about the carbohydrates is that these compounds do not contain nitrogen or sulfur or phosphorus. And if we think a little bit about plant nutrition, the plants that we grow as a crop require relatively large amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. The microorganisms, the bacteria and the fungi primarily, are also forms of plant life. They too need nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur to make more microorganisms or for their normal growth and development processes. So if the carbohydrates do not contain these elements, then they must be obtaining these from somewhere else. And that other source, or a primary source for those elements, is the second group of compounds, which are, as a broad group, are called the proteins. Well, we've already said that in addition to carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, proteins contain the elements nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Any one of these, or the combination of these, can be limiting to the rate of breakdown of the organic material. So proteins, because they contain these elements, and because they are also not very complex in structure as compared to some of the other compounds we're going to talk about a little bit later, proteins are also quite rapidly metabolized or broken down by the microorganisms in the decay of organic material. A third organic component of plants is a group of compounds which are called the lignins. Now the lignins, these are sometimes thought of as being complex carbohydrates, but they're really a little bit more complex than that. They're large ring-like structures. They contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but certainly not in the proportion of 1 to 2 to 1 like the carbohydrates do. Also typical in the lignins are some double and or even triple bonds between carbons, which make these components much more resistant to breakdown or decomposition by the soil organisms. Lignins have a tendency to accumulate in plants as plants get older. This partially explains why young or fresh plant material, when incorporated into the soil, will decompose at a much more rapid rate than do older, more mature types of plant materials, such as a grain stubble from a residue or residue from a grain crop. Well, I think you can tell or probably determine from what I've said so far that the lignins are very resistant to microbial decomposition. And in fact, these types of components will typically build up in or become a larger proportion of the humus, the semi-stable portion of the organic matter in the soil, than will the carbohydrates due to their much slower rate of breakdown. The last group of organic components in plants, based on our classification here today, will be the fats, the oils, the waxes, the resins, the tannins. In other words, it's kind of a catch-all group. Plants manufacture these types of compounds in typically fairly small quantity, but yet waxes is an example. That's an important part of the cuticle, or the protective layer of waxy material on the surface of the leaf. So these types of compounds play important roles in plants, but are typically not found in as large of quantity as we would have the first three groups, the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the lignans. Well, these compounds are neither extremely susceptible or extremely resistant to breakdown. What we can say about them as a group is that their rate of addition to the soil as a portion of the organic material or debris that's being added is somewhat comparable to the rate at which they break down. So we typically see these compounds being found in about the same proportion in the humus part of the organic material, that part that's been highly altered and resynthesized by the microorganisms, as what they were in the initial plant materials, plant residues that were being added to the soil. So it's a way of quick review again. We've got those four groups: carbohydrates, proteins, the lignans, and then finally the kind of catch-all group: fats, oils, waxes, resins, etc. Proteins break down rapidly. Carbohydrates are also rapidly decomposed. Lignans are very resistant to breakdown. As a matter of fact, lignans, as they increase in composition in the plant, can actually slow the rate of breakdown of some of the more complex types of carbohydrates, like cellulose, because they actually, the cellulose being found primarily in the cell walls of plants, actually becomes impregnated with lignin as those cell walls thicken and the plant gets older. So not only does lignin itself have a slow rate of breakdown by the microbes, but it also can slow the rate of breakdown of some of the more complex carbohydrates. Well, if we were to take a look at these four major components, carbohydrates, proteins, lignans, and we'll just call it the fats group to shorten this up a little bit, how does their composition in plant residue that's being added to the soil to become a part of the organic material, how does the composition of these components compare in fresh plant tissue as compared to, let's say, the humus portion of the soil, the part that's left after the easily decomposed components have been dissipated from the soil? Well, what we'll find is that we'll see an increase in the lignin content of humus over that of the fresh plant tissue that's being added, a very dramatic decrease in the carbohydrate content, and the fats, oils, waxes, and resins content will be about the same in the materials that are being added versus their content in the humus.